There are restaurants in this city where the waiting list is longer than most people's engagements, where the sommelier earns more than most people's fathers ever did, and where the phrase, "I'd like a table for two," is met with the kind of polite, immovable smile that means absolutely not. Aurelius was that kind of restaurant. It occupied the ground floor of a converted Beaux-Arts building on West 54th, the kind of address that made people lower their voices when they said it. The dining room held 42 seats, never 43. The menu changed with the seasons, sometimes with the weather, and always without explanation. A reservation required 8 weeks' notice on a good day, a personal referral on a normal one, and something closer to divine intervention on a Tuesday in October. The staff were selected the way rare books are selected. Quietly, deliberately, and with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. They were expected to know the provenance of every ingredient on the plate, the history behind every label in the cellar, and the name of every guest who had ever sat in their section more than once. Petra Sundelin knew all of it. She had worked the floor at Aurelius for 2 years, and in that time she had memorized the wine preferences of 37 regulars, learned to distinguish the sound of a guest who was genuinely undecided from one who simply wanted to be persuaded, and developed the particular kind of stillness that only comes from learning, very early, how to be invisible in a room that is watching you. She was 29. She had the kind of face that people described as composed, which was another way of saying she never gave anyone the satisfaction of knowing what she was thinking. Her dark hair was always pulled back before her shift. Her posture was the kind that instructors spend years trying to teach, and Petra had simply arrived with. She had not always been a server. 4 years ago, she had been 18 months from finishing a dual master's in international economics and Slavic linguistics at Georgetown. She had spoken at a departmental conference in Prague. She had been, according to her advisor, a careful man not given to exaggeration, one of the most precise thinkers he had encountered in 2 decades of teaching. Then her mother had been diagnosed. Multiple sclerosis, progressive, the kind that moved fast and didn't negotiate. Her mother's insurance had covered 40 cents on the dollar. The rest had arrived in envelopes with red borders and increasingly formal language, and Petra had looked at her stipend, looked at the bills, and made a decision that took about 4 minutes and cost her something she didn't have a name for yet. She had left Georgetown in November. She had started at Aurelius the following March, initially as a food runner, then on the floor within 6 weeks because the general manager, a meticulous Frenchwoman named Colette, had noticed that Petra remembered things. Petra never talked about Georgetown. There was no particular reason to. On the Friday evening in question, the dining room was operating at its usual quiet intensity. The low percussion of crystal and silver, the murmur of conversations that cost money by the minute, the smell of brown butter and fresh thyme drifting from behind the kitchen doors. Petra had taken table 7 at 7:15, a party of 4 celebrating what appeared to be a corporate anniversary of some kind. Pleasant enough. Table 11 had come in at 7:30. A couple from Boston who visited every time they were in the city, and always ordered the tasting menu, and always, without fail, asked whether the kitchen could substitute the foie gras course. It was at 7:45 that the host, a young man named Thomas, appeared at Petra's elbow with the look of someone delivering information they were not entirely sure how to phrase. "Table 4, he said quietly. "Fenwick party. 3 guests. The primary reservation is under Brennan Fenwick." Petra knew the name. Most people in certain circles knew the name. Brennan Fenwick had built a logistics software company out of a 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe and sold it 8 years later for somewhere north of $4 billion. Since then, he had reinvested, restructured, acquired, and generally conducted himself with the kind of energy that suggested he found ordinary life slightly too slow. He was on the covers of 2 magazines, currently on newsstands. He had opinions about everything and a publicist to make sure those opinions reached the right people. He was also, according to 3 separate colleagues Petra had overheard discussing him in the past year, extremely difficult. She straightened her jacket, lifted her notepad, and walked to table 4. Brennan Fenwick was younger than his press photos suggested. Early 40s, athletic in the way of men who have personal trainers rather than physical hobbies, wearing a jacket that had been very expensively designed to look effortless. He was already talking when Petra arrived, making a point to the man on his left with the focused intensity of someone who was always, in some sense, presenting. The woman across from him was different. She was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in rooms full of important people and had long since stopped needing anyone to know it. She was reading the menu the way people read contracts, carefully, without expression. Her name, Petra would later learn, was Adeze Okonkwo. She ran the North American operations of a European investment consortium that managed, depending on the quarter, between 12 and 15 billion in assets. She was in New York for 4 days. She had agreed to have dinner with Brennan Fenwick because her New York director had asked her to, and she had not yet decided whether that had been a good use of an evening. The third guest was a younger man, an associate of Fenwick's, who spent the meal looking at his phone at intervals he believed were discreet. "Good evening," Petra said. "Welcome to Aurelius. My name is Petra, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I begin with still or sparkling water?" Fenwick glanced up. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, as a quick assessment, a calculation of relevance. "Sparkling," he said. "Evian, if you have it. We do, and we'll be doing the chef's tasting. All 3 of us." He said it without consulting his guests. The associate nodded. Adeze Okonkwo continued reading the menu for a moment longer, then set it down with a pleasant neutrality that communicated nothing. The first hour proceeded without incident. Petra moved through her tables with her customary efficiency, keeping her attention divided in the way that experienced servers learn, present at each table, aware of all of them. She noticed that Fenwick was performing. It was a specific kind of performance, the kind directed not at the people across the table, but at the one person whose assessment he needed, and he was doing it with the slightly elevated energy of a man who could feel the performance wasn't landing quite the way he intended. Adeze Okonkwo ate with appetite and said relatively little. She asked one question about the third course, the sourcing of the black truffle, and listened to Petra's answer with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested, not merely being polite. Petra answered in full. The truffles were Perigord, winter harvest, sourced from a family operation in the Dordogne that had supplied the restaurant for 11 years. Adeze nodded once, as if confirming something. Fenwick watched this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but belonged to a recognizable family of expressions. The slight narrowing, the recalibration. It was during the fourth course that things shifted. Petra had set down the plates, a seared duck breast with a reduction that had taken Chef Moreau 3 weeks to perfect, and was describing the preparation when Fenwick leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who has decided to change the subject entirely. "Tell me," he said, and he was looking at Petra now with a new kind of attention. "Do you actually know anything about what you're serving, or is it all memorized from a card somewhere? The table went quiet in the particular way tables do when someone has said something that everyone understands is not quite what it appears to be. "I know the menu," Petra said. Her voice was even. "Sure, sure." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that is shaped like warmth and made of something else entirely. "But I mean really no. Do you know, for instance, what region of France produces the finest duck confit? Not the Dordogne, before you say it. I know the truffle answer. Gascony," Petra said. "Specifically, the Gers department, though the argument between Gascony and the Landers has been running for about 200 years, and neither side shows any interest in conceding." Something crossed Fenwick's face, not displeasure exactly, more like the recalibration of an approach. He turned to Adelaide for a moment, as if checking whether she was watching. She was cutting her duck with measured precision and appeared to be paying attention only to her plate. Fenwick said, turning back to Petra. He said it the way people say impressive when they mean not yet enough. "You speak any languages? Besides English, I mean?" "A few," Petra said. "A few." He said it back with a slight emphasis, the beginning of something. "Which ones?" "Russian, Polish, some Czech." She paused. "Some others." He reached for his wine glass, turned it once. "Interesting. You know, I spent some time in Eastern Europe. Fascinating region." He set the glass down. "Interestingly, I picked up a bit of Polish while I was there. Business travel." Petra waited. What happened next was something Petra would replay later, not with anger. She was not, by nature, an angry person, but with a kind of detached interest in how clearly she had seen it coming, and how precisely it had unfolded anyway. Fenwick looked at her, and in a tone of practiced casualness, said in Polish, "Tell me, how long have you been pretending to be qualified for things you're not?" It was not good Polish. The grammar was approximate, the accent the kind that suggested a phrase-learning app rather than any actual engagement with the language. But the meaning was clear enough, and it was directed at her, and the implication was clear. She wouldn't understand it, and he could say whatever he liked. Adelaide Okonkwo looked up from her plate. Petra looked at Fenwick for one moment, not a long one, and replied in Polish that was entirely different in quality from the Polish of someone who had spent a winter in Krakow and another in Warsaw and written a 40-page thesis chapter in the language. About as long as some people have been mistaking confidence for competence, I'd imagine. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room where something has been understood by everyone present and acknowledged by none of them. Fenwick's smile did not disappear, but it changed. The architecture of it shifted in a way that was not quite visible, but was entirely legible to anyone paying attention, and Adelaide Okonkwo was paying attention. "You speak Polish," Fenwick said. "In English." "Yes," Petra said. "Where did you learn?" "Graduate school, primarily. Georgetown." She did not elaborate. She had learned over time that not elaborating was its own kind of answer. Georgetown. He repeated it with an inflection she had heard before. The slight recalibration, the reassessment of who he was dealing with, and whether the approach needed updating. "What were you studying?" "International economics and Slavic linguistics." She paused. "Will there be anything else for this course, or shall I give you a moment?" "No, we're—" He stopped. Started again. "You left? You didn't finish?" "Family circumstances," Petra said pleasantly. "Can I bring anyone a water refresh?" She left the table at the exact pace she always did, not faster, not slower. Behind her, she heard nothing, which was the sound of a table that had temporarily run out of words. In the kitchen, she set her tray on the pass and stood still for exactly 4 seconds, which was how long she allowed herself. Then she picked up the next course and went back out. The remainder of the dinner was quiet in a different way than the beginning had been. Fenwick ate. He made conversation with his associate about something logistical and specific that had nothing to do with the table. He did not address Petra again beyond the functional minimum, which suited her entirely. Adaeze Okonkwo, however, did something unexpected. When Petra arrived to clear the dessert plates, Adaeze looked up and said, in a conversational tone, as if they were simply continuing a discussion that had been briefly interrupted. The Gers versus Landers debate, you said neither side shows any interest in conceding. Do you have a position? Petra glanced at the table. The associate was on his phone. Personally, Petra said, yes, the Landers duck has better fat content for confiting, technically, but Gascony has the better argument because they've been making it longer and louder, and in France, longevity of argument carries weight independent of the underlying merits. Adaeze looked at her for a moment. Then something happened at the corners of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. That's a very precise answer, she said. Thank you. It's also, Adaeze said, an extremely good description of how certain business negotiations work. Petra said nothing. She set the dessert plates on her tray. You left Georgetown when? Adaeze asked. The question was casual, but it wasn't. 4 years ago, 18 months from finishing. Your thesis topic? Petra paused. In 2 years of working the floor at Aurelius, no one had ever asked her that. Eastern European market integration post-2008, she said, with a focus on linguistic barriers as economic friction in cross-border trade. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the exact problem we've been trying to solve in 3 markets for 2 years. Petra did not say anything to that either. She had learned, over time, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in a conversation was simply stay still and let the other person's words occupy the space they deserved. Your circumstances, Adaeze said, and she said it in the way of someone who has made careful assessments and is now moving with intention. Are they still preventing you from finishing? Petra thought about her mother's apartment in Silver Spring, the medications now covered by a plan they'd spent 14 months fighting to get, the bills that had gone from red borders to black ink to finally, 3 months ago, settled. No, Petra said. Not anymore. Adaeze nodded slowly, as if confirming an internal calculation. She reached into the slim leather folio beside her plate and produced a business card that was heavier than most and said almost nothing on it except her name, her title, Director of North American Operations, Aldenmore Capital Group, and a number. She held it out. Petra took it. My chief analyst has been telling me for 6 months that what we need is someone with exactly your background, Adaeze said. The economics and the language both. It is, as it turns out, a rare combination. She glanced briefly and without particular emphasis in the direction of Brennan Fenwick, who was still on his phone and had missed the last 4 minutes entirely. Send me your CV. Whatever you have, unfinished degrees and all. I'll have someone reach out to you within the week. Petra looked at the card. It was the kind of card that did not need to announce itself. I'll do that, she said. Good. Adaeze picked up her water glass, then set it down again. One more question. Of course, the truffle. Perigord, winter harvest, family operation in the Dordogne, 11 years. She looked at Petra steadily. Did you know all of that before tonight, or did you research it when you knew who was coming to dinner? Petra allowed herself a small, honest answer. I've known it for 14 months, she said. I looked it up the week I started taking over this section, because a guest asked once and I didn't know, and I don't like not knowing things. Adaeze studied her for a moment. No, she said. I imagine you don't. She picked up her wine glass and turned back to the table, and Petra collected the remaining plates and walked toward the kitchen with the same unhurried stride she always used. Brennan Fenwick's net eaten that evening came to $1,240 before tip. He left 18%, which was correct but not generous, and he signed the check with a flourish that suggested he was aware it was a significant number. He did not look at Petra as he left. Adie's Okonkwo stopped briefly at the host stand to retrieve her coat and said to no one in particular that the duck had been exceptional. She did not say anything else. 3 weeks later, Petra sat across from Adie's chief analyst in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building on Park Avenue with a printed copy of an unfinished thesis, 2 language certifications, and a letter of recommendation from a Georgetown professor who had not heard from her in 4 years but had responded to her email within 20 minutes. The interview lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the analyst, a spare, careful man named Gregor, who communicated primarily through silence and single-raised eyebrows, looked at his notes and said, "The role is officially junior research associate, but I want to be direct with you. If the first 6 months go the way I expect they will, that title will change." Petra thanked him. On her way out through the lobby, she passed a newsstand. One of the magazines on the rack, a business publication, the kind printed on heavy matte stock, had Brennan Fenwick on the cover. He was photographed looking at something off-camera with an expression of visionary confidence. The headline announced a new venture, a bold pivot, a chapter of disruption ahead. Petra bought a coffee from the cart outside. She stood in the October light for a moment, watching the city move around her at its usual indifferent speed. Then she put her earbuds in, pulled up the Aldenmore onboarding documents Gregor had sent her the night before, and started reading on the subway home. She had a lot to learn. She was, as it turned out, very good at that.